The mud in Normandy tasted like death and diesel fuel. Corporal James McLeod pressed his face against the wet earth as German artillery screamed overhead, shaking the ground beneath him like an angry god. 3 weeks after D-Day, the hedgerows of France had become a graveyard where young men died without ever seeing their killers. Jimmy had arrived at the front lines that morning with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, carrying a Lee Enfield No. 4 MK, sniper rifle wrapped in oilcloth like a precious child. While other soldiers lugged grenades and extra ammunition, Jimmy carried only his rifle, a notebook, binoculars, and the patience of a man who once tracked wolves through Ontario forest for 3 days without making a sound. Lieutenant Morrison did not trust him. The lieutenant had watched too many good soldiers die in these French fields, cut down by invisible German snipers who turned every farmhouse into a fortress and every church steeple into a tower of death. What could one quiet soldier with a special rifle do against an entire German defensive line? But Sergeant Roy Hicks, a grizzled veteran who still carried shrapnel from the First War in his left shoulder, saw something different in Jimmy's calm gray eyes. He recognized the look of a natural hunter, someone who understood that death was not about anger or courage, but about patience and precision. That on his first night, Jimmy did not sleep. While exhausted soldiers snored in their muddy foxholes, he studied the landscape through his binoculars, memorizing every broken tree, every pile of rubble, every shadow that did not belong. He marked distances in his notebook with careful pencil strokes. The German positions were not where they seemed to be. Jimmy knew this because he understood concealment. A good hiding place was never the obvious place. It was the spot that looked wrong, that felt too empty, too perfect. Dawn came gray and cold. Corporal Davies was heating coffee over a small fire when the German bullet entered his skull just above his left eye. The shot cracked across the morning air like a breaking bone. Men screamed and dove for cover, scrambling into foxholes with their hearts hammering against their ribs. The German sniper had fired from somewhere near the destroyed mill 400 yards away, a structure that looked like broken teeth against the pale sky. Jimmy did not scramble. He moved with the slow deliberation of winter ice forming on a lake, sliding behind a fallen oak tree that provided just enough cover. His rifle settled into position, but he did not aim at the mill. Instead, his scope focused on a shattered barn window 50 yards to the left of the obvious position. He calculated wind speed by watching grass movements, estimated range by comparing the barn size to structures he had memorized during the night, and thought about human nature. A good German sniper would not stay in the mill after shooting. He would have a second position prepared, somewhere unexpected. 2 hours passed. The other soldiers thought Jimmy had fallen asleep or was too afraid to move. Flies gathered on Davy's body. The sun climbed higher, creating harsh shadows that played tricks on tired eyes. Then in the barn window, a shadow shifted. It was barely movement at all, just a darker patch of gray against gray stone. Most men would have missed it entirely. Jimmy's finger found the trigger. He exhaled slowly, letting his heartbeat settle into a steady rhythm. Between heartbeats, there exists a moment of perfect stillness when the human body becomes absolutely motionless. In that fraction of a second, Jimmy squeezed the trigger with the gentleness of touching a baby's cheek. The Lee Enfield roared once. The sound echoed across the battlefield like thunder. In a barn window, the shadow jerked backward and disappeared. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then German voices began shouting in confusion and alarm. The invisible killer had been killed by another invisible killer. Sergeant Hicks crawled over to Jimmy's position, his face showing equal parts respect and surprise. "Clean kill," he whispered. 450 yards and wind. "How did you know he was in the barn?" Jimmy worked the bolt on his rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge. He would not stay where he shot from. That would be stupid. I just thought about where I would go if I was him. By noon, word had spread through the Canadian lines about the new sniper. By evening, soldiers were calling him the Ghost because he had appeared from nowhere and killed an enemy no one else could find. Lieutenant Morrison stopped questioning Jimmy's presence. In this war, results mattered more than skepticism. That night, Jimmy cleaned his rifle with religious care, running an oiled cloth through the barrel until it gleamed in the fading light. He thought about the German soldier in the barn, wondered if the man had a family, if he had been conscripted or volunteered, if he died instantly or suffered. These thoughts did not trouble Jimmy yet. That would come later, when the number of dead faces grew too large to count. For now, he was simply a tool of war, a precision instrument designed to kill from distance. The hunting had begun, and in the hedgerows of Normandy, the Germans were learning to fear the silent death that came from nowhere, delivered by a young man from the Canadian forests who understood that patience was the deadliest weapon of all. Fear spreads faster than bullets in war. Within 2 weeks, German soldiers along the Normandy front had stopped lighting cigarettes after dark, refused to stand near windows, and flinched at distant sounds that might be a rifle shot. They called the Canadian sniper Der Geist, the ghost, and they were right to be afraid. Jimmy McLeod had killed 11 enemy soldiers in 14 days, each shot fired from a different position, each kill absolutely silent until the moment his Lee Enfield spoke its single word of death. He never shot from the same location twice. He crawled through mud that soaked through his uniform and left his skin raw. He hid in shell craters filled with rainwater and the smell of explosives. He learned to shoot at dawn and dusk when the changing light confused the eye and made shadows lie about where danger waited. But the Germans were not stupid. They brought in their own expert snipers from the Eastern Front, men who had survived the hell of Stalingrad, where Russian and German sharpshooters hunted each other through frozen ruins. These professionals carried carabiner 98K rifles with Zeiscopes that could resolve a man's face at 800 yards. They understood camouflage, patience, and the mathematics of death. The hunters had become the hunted. Jimmy felt their presence before he saw them. On a gray August morning, he was moving through a destroyed farmhouse when instinct made him freeze. Something was wrong. The silence felt too heavy, too deliberate. He dropped flat as a bullet cracked past his head, so close he felt the heat of its passage. The shot had come from a collapsed barn 300 yards away, from a position Jimmy had dismissed as too obvious. The German sniper had read his thinking and turned it against him. For 3 days, Jimmy and the German played a deadly game of chess with human lives as pieces. Jimmy used decoys, placing helmets on sticks and coats draped over logs to draw fire. The German did the same, creating false positions with such skill that twice Jimmy nearly revealed himself by reacting. They were equals, 2 predators circling in the dark, each knowing that one mistake meant death. Sergeant Hicks accompanied Jimmy on every mission now, serving as a spotter and watching his back. Hicks had fought in the trenches of the First War, where men died by the thousands. But he said he had never seen anything as personally terrifying as this invisible duel where death came without warning. In the trenches, at least you knew which direction the enemy was, Hicks whispered one evening as they cleaned their weapons. This is different. This is like being stalked by a ghost. The breakthrough came from Lieutenant Morrison, who called them to headquarters with intelligence reports spread across a makeshift table. A German officer named Hauptmann Wolf was coordinating defensive positions from a chateau 3 miles behind enemy lines. He was effective and ruthless, and if he could be eliminated, an entire section of German resistance might collapse. The chateau was heavily guarded, constantly patrolled, and considered impossible to approach. Morrison looked at Jimmy with tired eyes and asked, "Can you do it?" Jimmy studied the map for a long time. Then he nodded once. They moved through German lines that night like shadows passing through a forest. Jimmy and Sergeant Hicks crawled under barbed wire, slipped past patrols, and navigated minefields by feeling for disturbed earth with their fingertips. Every sound was amplified in the darkness. Every snap of a twig could mean discovery and death. By dawn, they had reached a destroyed barn 800 yards from the chateau, a structure that provided cover and a clear line of sight to the building's second-floor balcony. Then they waited. 18 hours passed with agonizing slowness. They took turns watching through binoculars, eating cold rations that tasted like cardboard, urinating into bottles to avoid leaving their position. Mosquitoes bit their faces and hands. Rain soaked through their uniforms. Hicks whispered that he could feel his leg muscles cramping, but moving to stretch would risk being seen. Jimmy's back screamed with pain from lying motionless, but he did not move. He had learned patience from wolves who would wait all day for a single moment of opportunity. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward evening, Hauptmann Wolf emerged onto the balcony. He wore an immaculate uniform with medals glinting on his chest. He lit a cigarette and unfolded a map against the balcony railing, secure in his belief that he was safe behind German lines, protected by distance and armed guards. Jimmy calculated everything in 3 seconds. Wind speed, range, the slight downward angle, the target's partial concealment behind the railing. The mathematics of death became clear in his mind like a completed equation. He breathed slowly, let his heartbeat settle into its regular rhythm, and found that perfect moment between heartbeats when the body achieves absolute stillness. The shot cracked across the distance. Hauptmann Wolf dropped like a puppet with cut strings, the cigarette falling from his fingers in a small arc of red ember. Chaos erupted in the chateau as German soldiers rushed outside, searching frantically for shooters who had already melted into the landscape. Jimmy and Hicks crawled backward through tall grass, moving inches at a time, taking 2 hours to travel 50 yards. By the time German patrols reached the barn, the ghost and his companion were miles away, invisible once more. That night, in the safety of Canadian lines, Jimmy stared at his hands and noticed they were shaking slightly. 11 kills had become 12. How many more before the war ended? How many faces would he carry home when peace finally came? He did not know, but he knew the hunting would continue until someone made a final mistake. Some men become legends by accident, while others earn their reputation through blood. The German sniper the Canadians called Der Jäger, the hunter, had killed 14 men in 3 days near the destroyed village of Saint-Pierre during the desperate fighting to close the Falaise Gap in late August. He shot from impossible angles, vanished without leaving traces, and seemed to know where Canadian soldiers would be before they arrived. Some exhausted troops whispered that he was not human at all, but rather the spirit of death itself haunting the ruins. When Lieutenant Morrison asked for volunteers to hunt the hunter, only one hand went up. Jimmy McLeod's reputation had grown, but reputation meant nothing against a ghost who killed with supernatural precision. The village of Saint-Pierre had been beautiful once, with a stone church dating back 300 years and narrow streets where farmers sold vegetables on Saturday mornings. Now it was a nightmare of rubble and shell craters where the SS fought with the desperation of trapped animals. The Canadians needed to take the village to complete the encirclement of retreating German forces, but Der Jäger had turned the ruins into a killing ground where officers died before they could give orders and medics fell while trying to save the wounded. Jimmy studied the village for an entire day before entering, memorizing the layout of broken buildings, calculating sight lines, and firing angles. Sergeant Hicks wanted to come with him, but Jimmy refused. "If we both die, who will tell them where he is?" Jimmy said with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. Hicks recognized the look of a man who had moved beyond fear into a place where only the hunt mattered. For 5 days, Jimmy and Der Jäger played a game that redefined the meaning of patience and cunning. Jimmy set traps by deliberately exposing himself for split seconds, hoping to draw fire that would reveal his enemy's position. The German did the same, creating false targets so realistic that twice Jimmy nearly fired and gave away his location. They used mirrors to look around corners, decoys to simulate human movement, and the patience of spiders waiting in their webs. Once, a German bullet passed so close to Jimmy's head that he felt the heat and heard the angry bee sound of its passage. He did not move, did not flinch, because flinching would mean death. Sergeant Hicks grew worried. He saw something changing in Jimmy, a dangerous obsession that went beyond military duty. Jimmy stopped eating properly. He talked to himself while studying maps. His hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. "You need to rest," Hicks told him on the 4th night. "This is not worth dying for." "He killed 14 of our men," Jimmy replied, his voice flat and distant. 14 families will get telegrams saying their sons or husbands died in France. I cannot stop until he stops." The breakthrough came from patience and observation. Jimmy noticed that the church tower had a new hole in its stone wall, perfectly positioned for a sniper's rifle. It was too obvious, too deliberately placed. The hunter was laying a trap, assuming the Canadians would focus on the tower while he shot from a completely different location. But knowing about the trap gave Jimmy an advantage. He began looking for the real position, the place a truly skilled sniper would choose. He found it on the fifth evening. A drainage pipe beneath the church, partially hidden by fallen masonry, offered a perfect view of the street while remaining invisible to anyone looking at the more obvious tower position. It was brilliant concealment, the kind of thinking that separated professionals from amateurs. Jimmy prepared his own position in a collapsed house 600 yards away, angling his rifle toward the drainage pipe, while making it appear he was watching the church tower. As the sun began to set, creating long shadows that confused depth perception, a patrol of Canadian soldiers moved through the street below. It was bait, volunteers who knew they might draw fire but trusted that Jimmy would protect them. In the drainage pipe, a shadow shifted. The German sniper was preparing to shoot, confident in his hidden position. Jimmy fired first. His bullet entered the drainage pipe and did not exit. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the shadow in the pipe went still in the particular way that dead things become still. After nightfall, Canadian soldiers carefully approached the church with flashlights and weapons ready. They found the body of a German sergeant named Hans Dietrich, holder of the Iron Cross, veteran of 43 confirmed kills. His carabiner 98K rifle lay beside him, still clutched in fingers that would never pull a trigger again. In his breast pocket, soldiers found a letter to his wife and a photograph of 3 young daughters with blonde braids and serious faces. Captain Morrison brought the letter and photograph to Jimmy, who sat alone in a shell crater, cleaning his rifle. Jimmy looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. The little girls looked like they might have been nice children who played with dolls and asked their father to tell them stories. Now, their father was dead in a French drainage pipe, killed by a bullet from a man he had never met, in a war that made no sense when you thought about it too carefully. Jimmy carefully placed the photograph back in Morrison's hand. "Send it to the Red Cross," he said quietly. "His family should have it." That night, Jimmy walked alone into the darkness beyond the Canadian lines, ignoring the sentries who called after him. Sergeant Hicks found him an hour later, sitting on a stone wall, staring at nothing. Neither man spoke. Some victories carried too much weight for words. March 1945 brought the smell of victory and the taste of ash. The Allied armies were deep into Germany, pushing toward Berlin through a landscape of destroyed cities and desperate last stands. Everyone could feel the war, ending like a storm, finally exhausting itself. But the dying continued because some men refused to accept defeat. Jimmy McLeod had changed in ways that went deeper than physical scars. He was quieter now, more distant, as if part of his soul had stayed behind in France with the 37 confirmed kills that haunted his sleep. He drank more whiskey than he used to, slept less, and sometimes Sergeant Hicks would find him staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much death. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division encountered fierce resistance near a German town whose name Jimmy never learned and immediately forgot. SS troops had fortified the town with the fanaticism of true believers who would rather die than surrender to what they called enemy invaders. They had transformed every building into a fortress, every street into a killing zone. Canadian soldiers fell to machine gun fire, Panzerfaust rockets, and snipers who shot from hidden positions with the desperation of men who knew they were losing but refused to stop fighting. Captain Morrison called Jimmy to headquarters with a request that felt more like a plea. A German sniper team in the church tower was causing massive casualties, preventing the infantry from advancing. They needed to be eliminated so that men could move forward without being cut down like wheat before a scythe. Morrison's face showed the exhaustion of too many battles and too many deaths. "After this," he promised, "you can go home. You have done more than enough." Jimmy and Sergeant Hicks moved into position before dawn, finding a bombed-out factory 500 yards from the church. The factory had been a furniture manufacturer before the war, and Jimmy could still see the remains of chairs and tables scattered among the rubble like broken memories of peaceful times. From the factory's third floor, they had a clear view of the church tower where the German snipers waited, but something felt wrong. Jimmy's instincts, sharpened by months of hunting and being hunted, screamed warnings that he could not articulate. The position was too obvious, too exposed. The Germans were not stupid. They must have anticipated that the Canadians would send snipers. His instinct proved correct. German mortars began falling around the factory with terrifying accuracy, not random fire but targeted, precise bombardment. The Germans had known someone would come to this exact location. They had prepared the trap and sprung it perfectly. Explosions tore through the factory, shattering what remained of the walls and sending shrapnel screaming through the air like angry hornets. Jimmy and Hicks ran through the collapsing building as the world exploded around them. They dove into a basement just as the upper floors collapsed, burying them under tons of rubble. For hours they lay in absolute darkness, breathing dust, listening to the building settle above them with groans and crashes. Hicks whispered that he thought his leg was broken. Jimmy could taste blood in his mouth from where he had bitten his tongue. They dug slowly through the debris with their hands, pulling aside bricks and wooden beams, working toward a narrow gap where light filtered through. When they finally emerged in late afternoon, the factory was completely destroyed. But the collapse had created something unexpected. From the rubble, Jimmy now had a view of the church tower from behind, from an angle the Germans would never anticipate, because it should have been impossible. Through his scope, Jimmy saw them clearly. Two young German soldiers in the tower, barely 20 years old, drinking from canteens and talking to each other with the casual ease of men who believed they were safe. They were not hardened SS veterans, but conscripts, boys pressed into service during Germany's final desperate months. One of them laughed at something his companion said. The sound carried across the distance, a human sound in an inhuman place. Jimmy aimed his rifle. His finger rested on the trigger. The shot was perfect, the range ideal, the target unaware. 2 pulls of the trigger, and 2 young men would die. Their families would receive letters with formal condolences. Their stories would end in this forgotten German town. The war would not end any faster. These deaths would change nothing except that 2 mothers somewhere would weep for sons who would never come home. Sergeant Hicks whispered, "We have orders, Jimmy." Jimmy knew, but he also knew that the war was already over, even if the fighting had not stopped. Killing these boys would be murder disguised as duty. His hand trembled on the rifle. 37 faces haunted him already. How many more before he could no longer remember who he had been before the killing started? He shifted his aim upward and fired. The bullet struck the massive church bell, creating a deafening clang that echoed across the town. The bell broke free from its mountings and crashed down into the tower with tremendous force. The 2 German soldiers scrambled out in panic, abandoning their weapons, running into the woods without looking back. They would probably surrender tomorrow or the next day. They would live. They would go home. Captain Morrison never asked what happened. Sergeant Hicks never explained. Some stories were better left untold. The war ended 3 weeks later. Jimmy returned to the forests of northern Ontario, where he had learned to track wolves as a boy. His Lee Enfield stayed locked in a closet, never touched again. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, he stood among the trees and listened to the silence. He remembered that he had been a weapon once, a ghost who brought terror to evil men. But he also remembered choosing mercy when mercy was possible. And that choice, that single moment of not pulling the trigger, gave him a small piece of peace in a world that would never be peaceful again.